All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Picture this. It's November 1941. We're in Tobruk, Libya. The desert sun is absolutely beating down on 14,000 Australian soldiers of the 9th Division. And they are completely trapped inside a coastal fortress. I mean, they are outgunned, undersupplied, and surrounded on 3 sides by General Erwin Rommel's superior, heavily armored German forces. And the Mediterranean Sea is to their north, blocking any real hope of escape. Now, by every single rule of modern warfare, this besieged group of men should have surrendered within a few weeks. But as the sun set, something absolutely terrifying started happening in the dark.
Now, German soldiers stationed out in the forward trenches, they were literally just disappearing in the middle of the night. And keep in mind, this wasn't happening during the day when conventional battles were supposed to take place. It was happening in pitch blackness. When morning finally rolled around, the scenes left behind showed brutal, undeniable signs of close-quarters combat, knife wounds, blunt force trauma. The few survivors who actually made it back to their lines were just wide-eyed with fear. They were reporting that their trenches were being overrun so quietly that soldiers sleeping 50 feet away never even woke up. They literally said they were fighting ghosts.
So what exactly is going on here? We really have to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this mismatch. Because on one side, you've got the German military machine, rigid, highly disciplined, and incredibly successful across Europe and North Africa. On the other side, you have these completely outgunned Australians who had almost zero military tradition. We're talking about guys who were sheep farmers, cattle ranchers, gold miners, bushmen. How in the world could this group, which was often called a rabble in uniforms, manage to completely break the spirit of the world's most feared army?
142. Let that number sink in for a second. That is the number of men the elite German 15th Panzer Division lost in just the very first week alone. And almost all of those losses happened between midnight and dawn. This completely baffled the German commanders. They were used to daylight battles, predictable artillery formations, and rigid rules of engagement. They had counters for everything in the standard military playbook. But they had absolutely no idea how to stop an enemy that just melted away into the darkness.
Section 1. Bushmen versus the Rulebook.
You know, British and German intelligence initially just completely wrote off these Australians. They looked at their rigid European military manuals, which of course emphasized daylight operations, heavy firepower, predictable patterns. And by those standards, the Australians were just undisciplined colonials. They slouched, they argued with officers. I mean, try giving a rigid military order to an outback cattle rancher, right? It's probably not going to go well. But what the so-called experts entirely missed was their outback conditioning. These men had spent their entire lives surviving in some of the harshest, most waterless environments on Earth. They already knew how to track animals across bare rock, how to move completely silently so they wouldn't scare away prey, and how to navigate just by the stars. To them, the desolate, burning desert of no man's land wasn't some terrifying battlefield, it was just a familiar hunting ground.
And that brings us to General Leslie Morsehead. He was the Australian commander, and he realized exactly what kind of men he had. British headquarters kept sending him these frantic, angry telegrams demanding that he stop these unauthorized night patrols and force his men to sit defensively in their trenches. Well, Morsehead politely read them and then literally tore them up. He noticed his guys were restless and bored, sitting in trenches all day. But at night, they came alive. They were exceptional stalkers. And as he understood perfectly, you couldn't train a dingo to act like a show dog. You just let it hunt.
Section 2. Anatomy of a silent raid.
So how did they actually pull this off? The Australians engineered this clinical, terrifyingly simple operation using nothing but absolute silence, darkness, and close-quarters weapons. They went out in tiny teams of 8 to 12 men. They covered their faces in dirt to kill any reflection from the moonlight. They left their water canteens behind so there wouldn't be a single sound of sloshing water. Here was the playbook. Step 1. Wait for the 2 to 4 a.m. shift change when the guards are at their absolute groggiest. Step 2. Crawl to within exactly 20 to 30 meters of the trench. Step 3. Freeze dead in your tracks for 10 seconds anytime a flare goes up. Step 4. The silent strike.
I want you to really put yourself in their boots for a second during their first real test raid in April. You've got 12 guys from Queensland targeting a German observation post about 400 meters away. At 1:30 a.m., they leave their trench. Then begins this excruciating 90-minute crawl on their bellies, right through the barbed wire, literally inching forward and freezing under flares. By 3 a.m., they're 25 meters away. They silently assign targets just by pointing in the dark. They rush the trench, and the entire fight is over in less than 30 seconds. They left 3 Germans dead, 9 wounded, captured 4 prisoners, and then just slipped right back into the night.
Okay, so how do you scale that up for a massive, high-stakes target like Post 410?
Well, they deployed 40 of these Australian hunters, and this time it took them 3 agonizing hours to make their silent approach. Why so long? Because they had to move through a live minefield in total pitch blackness with a single guy at the very front probing the sand entirely by knife. One wrong move and it's over for everyone. But they made it. At 3:45 a.m., they poured over those trench walls. And the result? Over 200 German casualties. Plus, they captured maps showing every single tank position in Rommel's army. It was quite literally the most valuable intelligence of the entire siege.
Section 3. The psychological toll.
Now, here's an insane fact. The Australians were fighting with just a fraction of the ammunition that standard British units were given. But the thing is, they didn't really need bullets. Their weapons were their unlimited supply of darkness, silence, and fear. And the result? A staggering 70%, 7 out of every 10 German soldiers who were posted to the forward trenches facing the Australians became casualties within a matter of days.
Just look at this catastrophic difference. Your normal attrition rate from artillery and skirmishes, right around 12%. But when they were facing the Australians, that number absolutely skyrocketed to 70%. German officers started reporting a massive spike in discipline problems. Sick leave requests suddenly doubled, full of these really vague ailments, mysterious stomach issues, headaches, as utterly terrified men were just looking for any excuse they could find to refuse night duty.
This is wild. Even General Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, was shaken by this. In a diary entry from May 1941, he actually complained that he could anticipate every other enemy out there, because they followed predictable patterns. But the Australians? They fought by instinct. The German army literally had to rewrite their own rules on the fly. They started ordering guards to fire flares every 15 minutes, they tripled their guard strength, and they banned soldiers from sleeping in forward trenches entirely, all simply because they were fighting what they called unconventional devils.
So let's tally this all up. Over 242 days, the 14,000 guys who became known as the Rats of Tobruk launched 96 separate raids. They captured 5,000 prisoners and they destroyed 127 vehicles. Think about the pure mathematical irony here. Rommel had to dedicate 5,000 additional troops just to hold his defensive perimeter against them. This besieged force had effectively forced their 19,000 heavily armed attackers into a defensive retreat.
Section 4. Rewriting modern warfare.
When British forces finally broke through and ended the siege in December 1941, well, the secret was completely out. Military academies all over the world suddenly clamored to understand how these outback farmers had managed to terrorize history's greatest army. Within a few months, there was a massive global demand for their secrets. British commandos wanted to know their exact techniques. American Rangers were asking Australian officers to train them. The French resistance heavily studied their night approach methods. Even the Soviet army sent observers. By 1943, those 30-meter silent approach rules and close-quarters combat techniques the Australians perfected were being integrated into commando training programs everywhere.
And the cost of ignoring these new tactics was literally written in blood. Because when American and British conventional forces engaged the enemy using their traditional daylight, artillery-heavy tactics, they suffered up to 40% higher casualties than the Australians did in the exact same situations. The traditional rule-bound way of fighting cost lives, but the Australian instinctual adaptive method, it saved them.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that we can trace a direct historical lineage from these undisciplined Bushmen straight to the modern battlefield. What started out in the desert at the Siege of Tobruk in 1941 eventually evolved into the recognized concepts of asymmetric and guerrilla warfare that we saw in the 1960s and 70s in Vietnam. And today, the core foundations of every single modern special operations unit on Earth, from Navy SEALs practicing silent approaches to the British SAS learning close-quarters combat to Spetsnaz studying psychological warfare, they all owe a massive debt to those outback hunters.
We're going to wrap up this explainer with a thought about what we can actually learn from this today. You see, the Germans' greatest strength, their rigid doctrine and centuries of military tradition, became their fatal weakness against an enemy that fought by adapting to their environment. The Australians looked at their impossible situation and just asked, what do we know how to do? Because true power comes from adapting to reality, not just blindly following a rigid rulebook. So when you look at your own challenges right now, where in your life are you sticking to a manual that is failing you? Take a moment to really think about that. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer and keep questioning the rules.